So welcome everyone to another one of our webinars in our series. This is our Including Me webinar series. My name is Danny and I work for the Cheshire and Merseyside Women's and Health and Maternity Partnership, and I've got my colleagues here. Would you like to introduce yourselves?
I am Benin, Community Engagement Lead, Merseyside, Cheshire and Merseyside Women Health.
I am Becca, Community Engagement Lead, Cheshire and Merseyside.
Thank you. So welcome today. Today's webinar is on LGBTQIA+ families and the maternity services. This series has been devised to provide information, resources and support for all our communities across Cheshire and Merseyside and discussing key health priorities to improve women's health. We've got two great guests today who are going to be facilitating the Q&A and presenting. So we've got Dr. Christine Mimner. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Christine Mimner. I'm the clinical lead for the CMAGIC Cheshire Mersey Area Gender Identity Collaborative, one of the new NHS England pilot sites.
Fabulous, thank you. And we've got is it Dr. Thomas Smith?
Not quite yet.
Not quite yet.
In a few months. I'm a final year trainee clinical psychology at Liverpool Uni, and I got interested in queer therapy, and my thesis project is in gay parenting and non-biological lesbian mothers in parenting as well.
Perfect, thank you so much, and thank you for giving up your time today. It's much appreciated. We know how busy you both are, so thank you. Right, over to you, Dr. Christine Mim. Now, would you like to start?
Yeah, I think the best thing to say about pregnancy for LGBTQIA people is that almost certainly the people themselves are going to change the way the services are delivered. So much of what we have believed as medical dogma over the last 30 years, certainly regarding trans people and certainly regarding the rest of the LGBT community, is based on nothing other than prejudice and opinion. So when it comes down to it, how families are constructed and how people survive going through healthcare systems really has to shift from the idea that we offer what we think is the right thing to do to shifting to we offer what it is you tell us you need. So I see that in my own field, gender identity medicine, all the time. When you look back, 30 years ago, crikey, it's actually longer than that, but I'm just getting older. Look back to the 1970s and think of if you watch the Change of Sex documentary featuring Julia Grant, first time gender reassignment was ever focused on the television, you see some very patriarchal gatekeeping is the only way for it, dealing with Julia. And back in those days, if the clinician didn't think you'd make a good man or woman, then they didn't even help you. And you only got help in your transition after you'd proved that you could transition effectively without help, which I know makes no sense. But we're kind of seeing that same thing again now with trans pregnancies. A study done by Ruth Pearce at Nottingham, I think Ruth's at, shows that 40% of trans people who are pregnant will free birth, which means they won't have any antenatal input at all. And that's ridiculous that we can have communities where, we know it's a big issue and people need to get their care sorted out. But we have systems that are not receptive to those individuals at this moment in time. And we need to change that. But the only way we're going to change that is by the community telling us what we should be doing and co-producing. I hate that word because it just means whatever you want it to mean. But making the services fit the community and not the other way around. I think that's probably all I need to say, realistically, because I know the big thing is going to be the discussion that we have.
Amazing, thank you so much. So please, if you can share your faces or not, it's entirely up to you. Thomas, have you got anything that you'd like to add or about your project and your research and what you're working on at the moment?
Yeah, well, I guess just to say that kind of most of the research at the moment kind of points towards actually there being quite positive outcomes in gay families, and with LGBT parents generally, outcomes are very, very good in terms of the children. And I tend to see kind of where the gap is at the minute is the experience of gay parents and kind of their experience of going through the birthing journey, but then also kind of raising children in what can be quite a homophobic world. So I think there's lots to be done still, but there's also a lot of things that are very positive for the community, and lots of things that really point towards very, very positive outcomes and very positive kind of experiences of gay parents.
Brilliant, thank you.
I've got a comment, and that I think it's really sad about the transgender people free birthing, because that's life endangering for themselves and their baby, and they must want that baby, you know, so much. So I wonder what we can do about that. I'm a midwife by background, and that makes me extraordinarily sad.
So I think the problem is that so much of our healthcare system is based on from a trans point of view, a binary system, but also on a cis heteronormative. Well, you probably know what that means, but basically the idea that a family is a man and woman and a couple of kids, whereas the reality is a family is a group of people that care for each other, however they come about. And certainly, you know, in the trans community, the fear that you will somehow have to deal with a system which doesn't know what to do with you, where to put you, that may have inbuilt bias, that certainly will have inbuilt bias, puts a lot of people off. And we see this not just in maternity services, it happens for everything. Life expectancy for trans people 17 years less than the rest of the population, so it's just a bit kind of biased. And I take my fair share of the blame as being a medic involved in provision of services for trans people. When you look back at sort of, you know, how we help people transition and preserve fertility, at the moment it's a choice between, do you want to start treatment or do you want to preserve fertility, and which is going to come first, because both could take months if not years to organise, and you need to choose. So in a way we're kind of pushing the old-fashioned trans people don't have kids idea. And up until recently, if you were a trans man, you're almost certainly going to be told that you probably needed to get rid of your uterus fairly quickly before it caused you problems, whereas that isn't actually the case. And when you look at Freddie McConnell and the fact that Freddie's now on to pregnancy number 2, that's pretty darn amazing stuff. But 20, 30 years ago, he'd have been told that he didn't, you know, shouldn't be keeping his uterus and should be getting rid of it. And you know, those kind of attitudes soak into your culture, so that you don't want to engage with healthcare services, and every bad experience you have is a downside. Thomas has got a point though, because, you know, look at Freddie, and there's a happy, successful family outcome, and you know, I just have to focus on the pathology of the system as well as the individual. And I know there are people out there who can focus better on the outcomes and the wins of the system. But yeah, 40% free birthing is just not great in anybody's book, really. And it gets worse. Intersectionality. So if you're a minority ethnic group, or a minority religious group, or a minority orientation group, then the more minor you are, the bigger the risks become. So we know that, certainly looking at the work in the States, people of colour who are trans have worse antenatal outcomes than you know, the cis white heteronormative setup. Again, Thomas's point, and I love it, is that actually if you get a baby in the process, gets looked after, grows up really well, and it's not you know, that there's a problem with parenting once you get through the system. My worry is that we're risking people at the stage when they really need medical and sort of clinical support in order to enable them to get on to being good parents that inherently they choose to be.
Yeah, I think I'm totally with you there. I think we should support them too.
I guess there's also an issue to consider around kind of information out there, because lots of the information around parenting journeys and how to access IVF, how to go through the NHS route, which is very difficult, is often anecdotal and kind of put out there. And unfortunately, the NHS doesn't have a huge amount of information there that kind of is quite accurate and non-biased. So it can be difficult to find out kind of what path you want to take to become parents as gay people, and kind of particularly for gay men, it can be quite a expensive and difficult journey. For lesbians and gay women, it's equally kind of difficult as well, and also very, very expensive. And I guess that's kind of one of the barriers to becoming parents. And I guess it's more recently that attitudes have changed from kind of gay people growing up and thinking that they'll never have children and just kind of assuming that, you know, that's just our lot in life, that we don't have children. We kind of see attitude changing now, but then I guess services in the NHS not catching up to that as much, because the access to kind of IVF and having children is quite difficult.
Yeah, I think it's also a bit niche in terms of knowledge. So if you look at the training that's given, again, you know, I'm a medic, so I know the medical stuff. You look at the training that's given to medics. I think there's a survey of American medical schools done, which worked out that there were 5 hours devoted to LGBT subjects, which, you know, that's an hour, basically. You're getting an hour per letter, which is not long enough. And so the general awareness of people's first port of call, whether it's nursing, midwifery, community services, or GPs, just that first knowledge barrier when somebody rocks up into the consulting room and says, you know, we want to have a baby, how do we do it? Most clinicians won't have that knowledge already loaded. Some won't even go look for it. And the ones that do will, as you say, Thomas, find a website like the HFEA website, which has one lot of information, or the nhs.uk website, which has another lot of information. And the information's kind of broadly the same, but there's differences in tone and understanding. And of course, between that national information and the individual in the community is the situation locally, how it's commissioned, what services are available, how do you get things done. So for instance, you know, a trans woman will be dealt with at Liverpool Women's Hospital, and a trans man will be dealt with at Liverpool Women's Hospital. And as long as we know that when you go to Liverpool Women's Hospital, regardless of your express gender, you're going to get looked after, it's not such a problem. But even that kind of pathway within the trust is slightly different, and shouldn't necessarily be a tough one to find. So one of the things that we're doing, looking at just something as simple as fertility preservation for trans people. At the moment, the old way was that you had to see a gender specialist to get a diagnosis and then be referred to the local services in Liverpool, and then they'd go and ask for funding from the commissioners in order to do it. Meanwhile, the gender specialist could have offered hormones, or might say, well, wait until you come back from that. And as a result, a lot of people said, well, actually, I'm just going to take the hormones. And the received wisdom of 20 years ago was that if you take the hormones, you'll never get pregnant. So they were kind of more or less mentally giving up the option for children back then. But nowadays, we know that's not the case. But if we just take a step back and say, well, actually, why don't we get pre-funding agreement for everybody that we see in the clinic? Because if we know they've got the funding agreed, then actually it's nowhere near as long. It's like a fairly, you know, it's still a couple of months, but it's only a couple of months as opposed to a recursive process of trying to find the funding and chasing people around different places. So just simple things about redesigning the pathway can make accessibility less of an issue, and remove that sort of idea that you have an either or when it comes to being trans or LGBT and pregnant.
So at the moment, if you are wanting to start a family, where's the first port of call for most people? Like what's the process, or is there not a set process at the minute?
It's usually straight into the GP, isn't it, Thomas?
Yeah, so from what I'm aware, it depends on I guess what letter you identify with, because it's a very different process for everyone. So
Okay.
I know for women, often it's kind of finding a donor and finding a clinic that you want to access. And I know that recently in the UK, the laws have changed in terms of having donors, that they need to be, they're no longer anonymous donors. So you kind of, when the child reaches 18, they have to be able to kind of identify who the donor is. But then identifying, going through your GP, and you will be able to kind of then, it's quite a complicated process to get IVF on the NHS. So lots of people tend to go privately. And that's, you know, that's a discussion in itself. But you kind of identify a clinic where you'll get donor sperm from, and then you will kind of go through the IVF process, and people might try several times doing that to get pregnant. And yeah, and then I think with gay men, it's quite a lot more difficult and expensive with gay men. I think that the laws in the UK, and I probably won't speak to this too much because I'm not hugely kind of clued up on the laws for gay men, but I think it's a lot more challenging in that kind of your legal rights to the child are quite kind of well, non-existent until after the birth.
Okay.
So
It's quite interesting, isn't it, just in the difference and a lack of knowledge generally, isn't there then, really?
yeah, and I think the difficulty is it's often we group kind of LGBTQI people all together, and it's, even though we share lots of similar experiences, the kind of practicalities of starting a family in each group can be quite different and quite unique as well. And the challenges you come up against and the cost and the different kind of things that come up can be quite different. And there is quite a lot of useful information out there. There's kind of Google queer parenting advice. There's articles that kind of take you through the process, but unfortunately nothing kind of too concrete from the NHS yet.
Right. Okay. So I think it's the intersectionality within it then, isn't it? Within the way that we group everyone, and I think that's the first stage, isn't it? Is understanding that there is differences, and hopefully from those differences we can then, you know, hopefully tailor advice that suits each, rather than, because not one size fits all, does it?
Yes, I think often, you know, from the conversations I've had with people as part of the our research at Liverpool, and kind of from the research that's out there already, lots of people describe not having a negative experience necessarily, but not necessarily having a positive experience, in terms of often when people say they've had a really positive experience, there's often a queer person in the team that kind of helped with that. But in terms of kind of guidelines and policies for the NHS, there's not really any, it's kind of team by team basis and a bit of postcode lottery in terms of how aware that people might be of LGBT issues. But then also there's lots of positive stories out there as well. And I think lots of people that I've spoken to have kind of said about finding online lots of negative kind of anecdotal stories about what's happened, but actually kind of broadly it seems there is a positive experience there that people are trying. And although they may not get it right all the time, people are kind of trying to understand and trying to kind of, they may kind of have those faux pas sometimes, and mix up pronouns, or mix up kind of, you know, identifying someone as an aunt or an uncle or a grandparent or something instead. But people are quite apologetic about it. And although it's not good enough, it's not as negative as you might find if you kind of just search online for those stories that come.
It's one of those things, isn't it? You kind of know when people are doing it to be mean, as opposed to when people are doing it by mistake. And you know, that's one of the things that you sort of get used to in accessing healthcare. If somebody's making a point for no good reason, then sometimes it's easy for them to score. And of course, the problem is if you're in any kind of healthcare situation on the receiving end of it, you are a vulnerable person. You're trying to establish a partnership of care, but quite often you're reliant on the professionals to put you in the right direction and treat you fairly. And if they have a bias, whether it's, you know, based on race, religion, gender, sexual orientation, who cares, then they should be professional enough to put that to one side and deal with human being in front of them in an honest and open way. So ignorance is fixable, bigotry less so. Generally people just dig in, which is a shame, really. Friend of mine talks about going to funnily enough, the Royal Liverpool, and having a lumbar puncture done. And of course, if you've ever had a lumbar puncture done, you're wearing one of those gowns that's open at the back, and you're lying there with your, as he put it, his hairy ass hanging out for the world to see. And he didn't mind, because, you know, that's what you do when you're in a lumbar puncture. It's okay. But then the junior doctor, clearly wanting to demonstrate that he'd read all of the notes, then persisted in misgendering my friend all the way through to his partner. You know, some kind of, why do that, really? Now, the point that my friend and colleague raises there was that he consented to lie there and have his bottom exposed to the world. He didn't consent to have his dignity taken away by not having the right pronouns. And if we think as clinicians in terms of you're trying to, you know, non-consensually doing something to a patient, you just don't do it. You need the consent. So misgendering, etc., fits into the non-consensual side of things. Same way with you know, if you have somebody coming in asking about fertility, and you say, well, what's your, you know, your partner, you know, and make an assumption about the nature of the partner. Okay, fine. You could argue that's what happens when the majority of the world is working one particular way, but actually I said partner rather than husband, which in itself is already a move to a better place in terms of not making the assumption. So if you've got clinicians who would assume husband straight off, then that's a bit negative in its way. But, you know, that's the world we're living in right now, and sometimes it does weigh you down.
I can imagine it does.
But Thomas is cheery, and I like that.
And it's great, and these are why these conversations need to happen, and that's why, you know, it's having those open discussions and hopefully just educating everybody on, you know, the kind of the differences, I suppose, like, you know, just knowing that, you know, when we talk about LGBTQI plus communities, and, you know, wherever I've looked in particular in healthcare with my nursing, it's always been grouped as kind of a one, you know, a one umbrella almost. But actually just learning that there's so much intersectionality within that, you know, hopefully the more educating we can get, the more we can hopefully remove some of them unconscious bias, because people are just more educated, and hopefully the ignorance will then kind of subside with that as well. And you know, I'll be perfectly, you know, as a nurse, there has been a time where I've, you know, mispronounced someone, or I have, you know, wrongly identified the person sat next to my patient, you know, and it very quickly became apparent that I just say now, so who's with you, rather than assume who it is. And it just became so who we got with you then, and let them introduce themselves, and then we've already got who we are and kind of what relationship they are to them as well. So I'll, you know, I've made that mistake myself, but it's about learning from it, isn't it? And it's about having the understanding that you can progress with the learning and not, you know, keep doing it. Then you're making a step forward, hopefully, to be more inclusive. Hi, Adam.
Hello, hi everyone. So my name's Adam Harrison. I'm the Patient Experience and Inclusion Manager at Warrington and Halton. I'm also a gay man. My pronouns are he, him. But I'm also the LGBTQIA plus staff network chair at the hospital. And I think it was really exciting when I seen this webinar. And I think what's so important is that we're talking about it. And I think that's just one of the factors. So the first thing I wrote down was around the 40% of trans people with free birth. And I think that start figure is something that will probably stay with me for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks after this. And that's the kind of almost message that I'm taking from this, that I think we need to share wider. And I know I've got colleagues from my trust on this call as well. And I suppose there's an element of, sometimes we think imagery will make the biggest difference. So putting some posters up, or putting some, for example, we've talked recently about, do we use same-sex imagery in our services, and is that enough? And I think one of the elements behind that is that it's the backbone of what we put into place underneath it. So training and support. And I just wondered from anyone else on the team, if there's anything from a training avenue that you've seen that has been able to support this. I think C Magic's a prime example and part of the actual transgender best practice clinical group across Cheshire and Merseyside. And as part of that, we're talking a lot about, is it actually just awareness that we need to start with? Because before we can even say we're going to approach and make a change, we need to build that level of awareness and just desensitize the culture that we talk in a very culture of inclusivity, but have we given everyone that conversation to continue to drive it? And I just welcome your thoughts really on what you think of that and directive channels.
I think, Adam, it's about raising awareness in the first extent. I'm really, really pleased I joined this call, because I thought I was inclusive and I don't think I am anymore. And I think that's a really healthy place to start. I mean, Christine and Thomas, I'm blown away by you. And I think I've done things as a midwife that I've not meant any harm at all, but I haven't been aware. And that's speaking really frankly to you. And I'm really grateful to have been on this call. And I've worked closely with Adam, so he's educated me, but I just feel so grateful to you. And I wonder how we get this message out there. And I throw that back at you three, really.
Yeah, and I think that's it. It's starting with this webinar, but how can we move? How can we build on this? This is a starting point, and this is the very early starting point. But then, how can we build on this webinar, and what can we do? You know, moving on, so that this webinar isn't just posted and it's kind of forgotten about, and that, you know, we've done it. It's not a tick box, is it? It's about, this is a building block, and this is the foundation of that. Where do we move forward?
There's a couple of things really that I think kind of crop up. Right now is a really tricky time for many trans people, because there are organisations out there that would like to drop the T and proceed only on sexual orientation grounds, and sometimes that's been done for political reasons, and they're just, you know, following a Daily Mail kind of mantra. But the truth, which at the same time is that, you know, we're better together, kind of sticking together and being visible together. It's also true that we're completely different in some of our needs. So I do not have life experience for as part of the LGBT community, although the B is becoming more of an issue. But I do have trans experience, and in terms of my understanding as a medic, I've got passing experience of LGB issues in primary care, and significant experience of the T issues. But as a specialist in training, I'm coming to the end of my specialist training in gender identity medicine, that makes me as qualified as a diabetologist to talk about orthopedic surgeons when it comes to, you know, as a gender identity medicine specialist talking about sexual health for LGBT people. That's just, you know, not my bag. That said, to make up for that and to kind of compensate, the best way for me to work is very closely with the Access Service, who've now provide the sexual health services for most of the patch, and to work very closely with existing general practitioners to try and get them on side, and you know, kind of make the network connections with the various places. That bit about the lack of undergraduate training, I did a session for the 5th years at Liverpool, soaked it up, fantastic feedback, ended up going back to talking to the F2s, the second year doctors, and again, similar thing, you know, stuff that they hadn't been taught but they knew they needed to know, which is pretty straightforward. And I do stuff for the registrars, but as a teacher in those circumstances, I can only really teach the T. The other bits are somebody else's area of speciality, and when it comes to subsets of the T, and the intersectionality, for instance, of what it means to be a person of colour, I'm out of my depth some of the time and have to engage other colleagues who can provide that kind of way of working. So from my point of view, it's a lot more about pulling together the threads, because I know if we pull it together, it'll work. Getting people switched on to the idea of cultural sensitivity for individuals is really good. An example, love a good tale. So one of my colleagues sees a patient who has a teardrop tattoo. Now, this colleague has watched a bit of the American police thingies and assumes that this teardrop is a sign of having murdered somebody or attempted to murder somebody, and that somehow it's gangland connected, and in a quite naive way, in my opinion, says, that tear you've got, have you actually killed somebody? And of course it isn't. It's they put it there in memory of a dead relative. And of course anybody with half a light would have asked the nice question, that's a really interesting tattoo. What does that mean for you? But he didn't, and he waded in with 2 feet and just made a complete and utter mistake of it. It's something he'll never do again, thank God. And you know, doubtless there are circumstances that we all make those mistakes in, but if we're approaching with a reasonably respectful, inquiring viewpoint, then I think we'll get there in the end. But yeah, I'm out of my depth on stuff that isn't my area, which terrible thing to say as a GP.
It's knowing limitations, though, isn't it? We all have limitations, and that's okay to have those limitations. And that's where, you know, networking and bringing people in and utilising our colleagues and friends and family is key. You know, just I'm thinking to like my children. So my sister-in-law married her wife a few years ago, and it was never really a discussion with my children, because to me it didn't need to be a discussion. It was just, you know, this is her wife and this is who she is. And it wasn't until we were dropping off at nursery one morning, and one of the nursery workers had just recently got married. And it was like, oh, who's that dropping him off? And I said, oh, that's his husband. And they all looked at me and went, husband? Why has he married a man? And just the simple kind of, because they knew, you know, they had 2 aunties and that was a given. I never thought I'd have to have the conversation about, you know, 2 men getting married. And I think that's where it starts, doesn't it? It's around just like, you know, how do I educate my children without bringing in any bias with it? Because I see it as normal, so I assumed that they did, and obviously they were curious. And you know, it's about answering that and not being afraid to answer it, isn't it?
I think that's, I'm so sorry to interrupt. I think that's like a prime example of like that entire discussion, isn't it? So I'm engaged to my soon-to-be husband, and my nephews have always known us as, we're both actually called the same name, so Adam and Adam, and we've always had that kind of life. And then I look at our younger nephews on his side, who are literally 2 and 4, and they've known us from the beginning as Adam and Adam together. And I think what's lovely about this for us is that they see us as the exact same as their mummy and daddy. And I think what's really interesting there is that the conversation has just started at that point. It's just been open for discussion. And I think sometimes there's always a fearful point of saying something wrong and not saying the right thing at the right time, and that stops people then from opening the discussion up, I think. And I think by opening that discussion and opening the channels, and that's something I'm going to take away from this webinar, to go and sit with our team and look at how do we open that discussion with our team, create that safe space in a sense of, let's talk through it, let's open the dialogue, and let's have this conversation, and let's normalize every single point of the beauty of LGBTQIA and the beauty that it is and the difference that it brings, because that's sometimes just a fearful point. That's my take on it anyway. And I think just listening to yourselves, that it just resonates with me in terms of how I'm thinking at the moment in time.
And I think lots of people talk about kind of coming out exhaustion. So, you know, you always have to kind of, well, you always have, before having children, lots of people talk about having the thought process of, oh, do I tell someone, do I come out, do I have to kind of explain things? And then kind of also what comes along with that kind of explaining things, you have to kind of tell other things about it. But when people have children, often they talk about kind of, actually you're outed a lot of the time, because you take children to appointments, especially with COVID as well, with kind of the restrictions on who can come in and play things. So often you kind of outed pretty quick at the school gates and hospital appointments and things. And I guess sometimes people talk about kind of this exhaustion of having to explain things, having to kind of, even though people don't, I guess, maliciously or deliberately or kind of in any kind of harmful way kind of say things, it's just kind of that having to explain things all the time and having to go through that kind of routine. And again, I guess you get used to it, but it's kind of how as services we're able to adapt and to normalize in a way and just kind of have it as an accepted thing, so people don't have to kind of have that extra thought process of, do I have to kind of explain this again? Process. And I think, you know, in terms of, you mentioned about training and things, and I think in terms of training, often it's just the experience of having gay people come through the service, and, you know, having experts by experience and people come in and talk about their experiences is much more powerful than kind of a PowerPoint presentation on how bad gays have it off and things. It's quite, it often doesn't sink in. It doesn't really make much of a difference. And I think having experts by experience and people come in and tell their stories, and to or just have kind of for want of a better word, kind of test cases, people come through and, you know, what adjustments do we make for people who are gay? What do we need to be aware of in terms of their journey so far, for what they've gone through with IVF? You know, often kind of people have much longer journeys through kind of pregnancy and through kind of maternity services because they've had to try a lot of the time. And, you know, for gay men, often they have to go to kind of America and go to different places in order to kind of be protected by laws as well, being aware of kind of the limitations of the law and kind of birth certificates and things like that. There's lots of extra things to think about and lots of extra things to do. And if services can kind of scaffold that and have information about that and support for that, that'll kind of hopefully go a long way to normalizing it. And so kind of when you've got leaflets, you have leaflets on gays as well as just everything else. So it's more kind of joined up and more accessible to people.
I think we have to work really, really hard to do that. It's that thing about humans. If you give somebody a negative piece of feedback, you have to do 6 positives before they'll actually balance out. So, you know, one negative experience requires a heck of a lot of positivity for the individual to sort of, you know, feel good about it. And part of that, I think, comes into kind of, you know, if you start on the wrong foot, and you getting back to balance is really tricky. So showing positive outcomes and good news stories. You know, okay, people get accused of preaching or brainwashing or whatever it is that you know is said about trying to make the world a less fair place. But fundamentally, I think we have to have that visibility out there for individuals. It's often said you can't be what you can't see, and, you know, success stories of the rainbow parenting approaches that exist and produce perfectly happy, healthy kids need to be shared in a way that kind of works. And even if it's, you know, in terms of inclusivity, women and then, you know, that needs to be kind of the way we think in maternity services, I think. But who knows? That's just my tuppence.
No, and that's great, because one of the success stories that was highlighted and got a lot of kind of views last year was, so I'm a part of the Maternity Voices partnerships, who, you know, kind of, I suppose, haven't been known to be very inclusive all round. And we do struggle with a lot of feedback sometimes from all different cultures and backgrounds, and you know, that's something that we are changing and working towards. But over in the Wirral, our chair has worked really closely, and she managed to share 2 dads who actually were able to be at the birth of their child, and they were part of that birthing journey. And, you know, it was a fight, and I think that's the sad part of it. It was a fight to be able to get them both in the room, but she did, and together they fought it, and 2 dads were able to witness the birth of their child. And I think that you know, that should be resonated everywhere else as well. And, you know, the process now, because it's happened, should be, I'm saying should be, much easier. And they're the success stories we need to share, and they're the ones that we need to highlight, because it does happen. And hopefully other people can learn from that, and other units across Cheshire and Merseyside will will make it easier for that to happen in the future.
But I think there's once you kind of start going into the issues, there's so much to kind of unravel and so much that comes up. I mean, in my project, we're thinking a lot about attachment and bonding early on in life as well. And I guess just simple things like skin-to-skin contact, which is kind of, you know, regularly considered with straight couples, and, you know, it's balanced out. But with gay people, and it's often neglected or not kind of thought about as much. So there's lots of kind of things that come into it, and I think it becomes a bit of a treasure trove of different kind of things coming up once you start opening up services. And I think sometimes it's not necessarily about kind of amending what we've got, it's about kind of thinking of what can we kind of start off with new, because it's there's lots of things that kind of just don't allow kind of gay people to fit into the system already, if that makes sense. Like with, you know, filling in forms and birth certificates, who's kind of, you know, there's a mother and father a spot, and that's kind of it. We've got to put one of you in the dad space, we've got to put one of you in the mum space. And I think lots of people talk about kind of private places kind of being a little bit ahead in that terms, as those very simple things like, you know, who's listed on the birth kind of scans and things like that, you know, mum and dad, you know, you could just put parent, and it's those kind of little things that might be kind of easy fixes, but it's just that awareness that doesn't always kind of cover them.
Yeah, and you're right, it's not difficult. I'm aware of a tweet I saw on Twitter the other day. I know it's an awful place. Somebody was announcing that their sister had just had a baby, and the person announcing it's kind of relatively well known and champions LGBT rights. And some cynic wrote back in what I think they thought was gender neutral language, saying that congratulations to the birthing person. I hope that and they actually used quite an offensive term, referring to the father, you know, the sort of spaffing parent, I think it was, to use Boris's phrase. You know, hope that they're going to wait an appropriate amount of time before deciding to observe the gender of their child. And I was thinking to myself, you know, yeah, I take your points, you're being sarcastic with it, but really this person's celebrating a baby. Just enjoy the baby and don't try and rain on the parade, you miserable person. But, you know, however people choose to celebrate and acknowledge and get their space, their foundation for that child's life, I think should just be respected. It's a shame that poor old Freddie McConnell has to go to Sweden in order to appear as the father on the birth certificate of his child, which is just crazy.
It is. And Debbie, it's got me thinking of a lot of things that we could probably bring about in the LMS, in like things that we can maybe support trusts with and kind of identify with them as well. It's got me my cogs going a little bit on what, you know, what we can do building on this webinar.
Yeah, I definitely think so as well, Danny. I think it's really interesting.
I wonder how long before you have a joint antenatal clinic between gender services, sexual health, and yeah, that'd be really interesting.
Absolutely.
Don't know, not thought about it, just throwing it out there.
I think we need to be delivering antenatal care much more joined up, you know, like you just described, for all people really. And it's really certainly food for thought, because I'm thinking of the multiple layers, you know, people, as you said, of colour, or people from really deprived backgrounds, and how that compounds what's already a tricky problem in our NHS currently.
So, Leslie, do you want to come in?
Yeah, hello everyone. Sorry, I was a little bit late home from work, so I was a bit late joining you. I've really enjoyed listening. Actually, it's been really good, and a bit like Debbie, I'm sort of quite have a lot to learn basically. But I just wanted to say that I've just recently done a 2-day staff training. I'm the infant feeding lead actually at Ormskirk Hospital, and we've just had a staff training day on breastfeeding and breastfeeding support, and we did have a really good conversation about the awareness of same-sex mums and induced lactation as well. We've recently had a few mums that have come through the maternity system, and both mums have been able to breastfeed their baby, and it was a really good positive conversation, that and the awareness that that we can support these mums with this. So I just wanted to bring that into the conversation, really, because I wasn't sure whether I'd missed anything at the beginning.
No, not at all, and thank you for sharing, because that's definitely something that is becoming more aware that and we've had a few people come through the MVP as well that have said about that, and we've been able to signpost to say that no, both of you can breastfeed as well. So that's been quite nice, that we've been able to refer people in the right direction as well, and where to go to get that support.
It's interesting. We have a rise, I suppose, or a brand now for T for T, trans for trans relationships, which as time goes by will potentially mean that we could end up in a situation of having the birthing parent not wishing to chest feed, as they would see it, but the non-birthing parent having induced lactation. So fascinating possibilities, I suppose. Dare say it'll have the creational fundamentalists up in arms and down in legs about it. Hey, it's just the price you have to pay for trying to help people.
And at the end of it, it's that baby that's gaining, from that situation.
And it's exactly what you said right at the beginning, isn't it? Ultimately, it's about the love that child is going to get, regardless of where it comes from and how that family is developed. So fab. Well, that has been absolutely fascinating. So thank you so much for all of your time and for your knowledge, because like Debbie and Leslie said, I've got a lot of food for thought and a lot of things that my cogs are starting to turn a little bit. And I think one of the things that I'd just like to say before we kind of finish off is, this is definitely going to be a foundation block, and we're going to build on it. This is definitely going to be a starting point on where we can go, and what other kind of avenues we can go down and support with in general in the maternity across Cheshire and Merseyside. And anybody's support would be greatly appreciated with that, so that we can get it on the right track and definitely be in the right pathway of what we want to do. So unless there's any more comments, any more questions, anybody else who wants to say anything before we close off? No. Well, thank you all for coming tonight, and I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. And thank you to Dr. Christine Minma and Thomas Smith. So much knowledge there, and it's been really, really good to listen to you. So thank you very much.